So back when GameKeto started in 2013, before it was a game development club in 2015 and onward, it was primarily a private training situation, one-on-one. I like to refer to it kind of like guitar lessons, 1 hour a week, phone calls, and I still have maybe a half dozen clients I continue this pattern with, but for the most part, obviously the focus these days is on the club. What I want to do in this video is cover some of the questions I would ask someone on their very first consultation, their very first call with me, that I would use to help feel out and figure out what things they might want to work on next, what path they want to be on. And I offer these questions today in part because I haven't added a new training client in a long time, bar kind of one exception, special case. And so aside from that, this isn't really the business I'm in anymore. Now with the club, it's quite different in structure and pattern and so on. But I'm going to share those questions today so you can get a sense for what it was like. And I really want you to go through this kind of actively. Not to just be passively listening to me for curiosity of what did I ask training clients on day one, but for yourself to really be thinking about these answers. And I'm not going to artificially pause and, yes, I see, as I pretend to listen to you because that seems silly. But I will ask the questions, and I encourage you, if you don't have a snap answer to it, pause, give yourself a chance to think about your answer to it before you continue, and hopefully it can help you find your next steps, your direction, your path you want to proceed down. And this is something which really is about picking a path. It's not about accepting or rejecting. It's not about figuring out, oh, it's not for you then. It's just to figure out, okay, there's so many different directions you can go when you're making games. Which one makes sense for where you're at? So the first question I'd always lead with was if there were some sort of either classic or casual or mobile games that interest the person. Maybe games they played as a kid, maybe games that they played that inspired them to get into making games, but also even just really, what's the simplest kinds of games that they've enjoyed? And this is important because in order to get that footing into making games, it's useful to have figured out, okay, well, even if I also like some extravagantly complicated games, there are some simpler games I've at least found fun. Because those can be much better targets when you're starting out. In many cases, of course, the sophisticated AAA type stuff we may never actually work on, or if we do, it'll be as part of an enormous team. But for full control of a solo developer, or even a small recreational team, it helps to, again, be based on, is there a classic? Is there a casual web? Is there a mobile game that you've enjoyed? That's much more basic in its foundations that we could use as an early target to either build towards or even start with. Is there anything that interests you most about game making? It's our second question. And this is important because game making is a really rich and diverse field, right? Some people really love it for the storytelling and the characters. Some people really love it for the mechanics. Some people just love the exploration and the spaces. Some people find it kind of another curious way to communicate and want to explore its versatile use in communication of ideas or persuasion. And all those things come from what interests you most deeply about game making. Because depending on your answer, it's going to help us reprioritize where you're going to get the most bang for your buck in terms of the time you're putting into learning the craft and in terms of the kind of projects you're getting behind you in your portfolio. Next question is any themes of interest that you have. And this might be something as simple as a cliche, like you like science fiction, or you like fantasy, or you like, you name it, westerns. It might also be something where it's a little more nuanced. If you like themes of revenge, you have a fascination of stories about self-discovery, some sort of theme that interests you. And this is important because from the consumer side, when you're playing games, you can switch between 4 or 5 themes in an evening, just switching between games. But when you're building something, and everything I work on and train people in is bigger than jams, so we're looking at minimum weeks, maybe months, in some cases literally years, you're going to have to live in this headspace of this theme. You're going to have to read about the theme, you have to think about the theme, you have to come back to the theme week after week after week, and that means really finding something where you're going to be happier from doing that and not hating yourself and being excited and eager for just having it finish, because you're doing this to practice it, and that means you want to find something you're enjoying, and that's going to mean picking a theme that actually interests you, not just sort of the first thing that comes to mind. Really taking some time to explore, are there themes you've enjoyed from fiction, from games, and so on, that you are happier digging deeper into. Might not even be the first project. It might be abstract for a project or two building up to that. Now, related to that as well is, do you have an interest in experimental gameplay or kind of artsy projects? And this has increasingly been a important, relevant part of the indie conversation and the academic experience as well. in which on the one hand, there are certainly conventional types of games. I just want to make something kind of like Space Invaders or Asteroids or a zombie action game or, established conventions of the genre of platformers. I want to jump around, I want to get the items, I want to finish it, and I want to make it real polished and show nicely. On the other side of that spectrum, there are things which try to blatantly either defy or avoid conventions to do some weird stuff. But somewhere within that weird stuff are things that either find a curious niche of an audience or might tap into something new and cool that previously has been underexplored. So that's a question of, again, are you into experimental gameplay and artsy stuff or more conventional styles of games? Because that can help influence your early projects as well as what types of skills we want to focus on and what kind of feedback we're seeking, what kind of examples and references we're drawing upon. Do you have a preference between platforms? And I don't just mean tech platform, I mean so in terms of devices, a touchscreen tilting device with multi-touch is going to be different to design for than a game controller, which even if you're not porting to a console yet because of all kinds of business and publisher and distributor realities, you can at very least write a game to play with a gamepad USB controller and feel like a console game, or design a game to that affordance by using only a handful of keys on the keyboard, your arrows, and a few buttons, as opposed to if you really enjoyed playing like MechWarrior 2 and Jane 64D Longbow and so on back in the day where kind of deep traditional PC games where there's a 104 key keyboard, let's use them all. That's a different attitude of design. And so it's figuring, are there certain kind of platforms of traditions of games that you enjoy? If it's arcade, you want it to be pick up and approachable, and we can kind of draw from those control schemes, inspirations, examples to start from. There's an important question to also confront that you can pivot and change your mind on later, but is one which sometimes is an invisible question people starting making games, and that is, do you like game design? Do you have an interest in the design questions? And by design questions, I of course mean how the player moves and why. About how the actions and power-ups, what they should do, instead of how to make them do that. And some people, it seems so obvious that that is an interest, it's absurd to be asked. Other people didn't realize that, yeah, you can actually just be really focused on the technical challenge of how to make a game do a certain thing without really having an interest in why to do X instead of Y out of your options. One of my early mentors in game design, well, game development rather, suitably, he had made a game for the arcade that I loved when I was a little kid. When I finally met him and worked with him many years later, talking to him about the experience, I realized he actually couldn't care less about game design. It's not his thing. He really liked hard technical challenges. He really liked the software engineering puzzles, partially liked the electronics difficulties of making things work in the arcade. But at the end of the day, he was really like, I just wanted management and designers and producers, whatever, hand me a thing to go do so I could go puzzle over how to make a machine do that. That's perfectly fine. There's a question of your comfort and willingness to engage in programmer art, right? And there's a range here as to there are programmers who will, by personal choice, never touch or create custom assets. I find that can be difficult to work with, but you can work with it if that's your situation. There are people who are comfortable and okay with, okay, well, I'm at least, this is what I encourage, gonna make some recognizable fundamentals. I'm gonna get comfortable enough in something like Photoshop or something like Blender, maybe Pro Builder within Unity, that I can mash out a shape, I can mash out a thing, so the player can tell that's a helicopter, that's a chair, that's a power-up, that's a goal, that's a switch, right? So just representationally, and then moving on without getting caught up in the aesthetics. Or there's people who full on, they really have an interest in the graphic design element, the visual arts, color theory. As a trainer, I'm less able to treat issues in those fields or advise on them, but even recognizing that that's someone's interest helps us then, okay, well, let's define a project that's going to help utilize that, train that, practice that skill, display and demonstrate that as a strength, as opposed to the other kind of design spaces we'll explore, and if someone's more at the where they're at in their programmer art level of comfort. Professionalism in terms of how you like your code to be, if you want it to be really, really engineered and architected, seemingly professional grade, or if you're comfortable with it being very hacky, which anyone who's been in professional game development can actually tell you a shocking amount of professional game development code is also pretty hacky. And actually sometimes the opposite, where sometimes students do something that's way more architected and engineered. But here's what this is about, right? This is about when you're writing a component, when you're developing part of a game, to what extent are you allowing yourself to get way kind of lost in the weeds of wanting something to be maximally repurposable, reusable, generalizable, which can be kind of a black hole for your time if you're not careful. Right? You got to approach things differently. If your goal is to just get the game done and you want to be able to thrash and experiment and try out some game stuff and get some stuff behind you, then hackiness, it can be an asset. It can be a virtue in those kind of situations. But it also depends on someone's goal. If their goal is to, as a solo auteur, create a lot of crafty, experimental, weird, personalized things, be in jams, etc., hackiness might be embraced. On the other side, there might be this need to really want to slow down. If someone's real goal is they want to find a software engineering position, maybe not even in games, in more traditional software, and they're just using games as an entry point into programming because it sounds like a fun challenge, and it is, then knowing that, it can be extra important to, okay, well, let's really study some programming patterns. Let's really kind of like take a moment and kind of go through some code review. Let's really slow down, make sure we understand each thing and why it does what it does, besides I fiddled with numbers till it did this interesting thing and now it's good, let's move on. So that's another point to figure out where you're at kind of in that continuum. If you've ever done 3D modeling or not, it's a whole separate question. It's a whole kind of different ball of wax from 2D programmer art, but it of course affords certain kind of opportunities and projects. I tend to ask someone if they've already got experience in Unity or not. It's a popular enough platform that a lot of people have already done some dabbling in it, but it's another thing that's useful to consider, in part because, I'm not sure if you've seen some of my other materials, videos about this kind of stuff, but I've often found there's benefits for someone to get more out of Unity if they have also done game development without using a game engine or even a game graphics library. So rather than using something like, and it's not because Unity is bad, it's because so many things that it does about your collision, your input, your movement, your physics, your graphics, your all kinds of stuff it does for you. It can come across being a little default Unity if you don't have experience outside of an engine, just doing even some fundamental retro kind of basics to get a sense for your own ways to write basic collision code, movement code, input smoothing, and so on. Some of those same models and ideas and concepts can carry over and allow you to override and make it a little more your own, get more horsepower, versatility out of something like Unity. But it's figuring, okay, do you have Unity experience? And equally important, do you have non-Unity, pre-engine, outside of engine experience? If you've worked on projects before, there's a point where I then ask what kind of projects they've worked on. We take stock of those. We figure out the things they've liked from those projects and they've disliked from those projects. That might inform what they want to do down the road. Ask if someone has experience making custom tools. I think it's valuable for every game programmer at some point in their experience to make some sort of custom tool, such as a level design tool for their game. Might have some special affordances, like being able to have it auto-complete puzzles, like having it be able to auto-generate which tiles should connect to which. But this exercise can be really freeing because it helps accentuate the overlap between your programming skill and your interactions with your project as a designer to be able to accelerate your design work through the use of your semi-automation or mastery of formats and so on from the programming side. But again, have you got experience yet making custom tools? And if not, I think it could be a valuable stepping stone in your progression, where even if you move on to Unity, a lot of what you can do in Unity is, of course, customizing the inspector, building in custom features into the engine, using some of the support that Unity provides. If there are other game development environments or languages you've tried, this, of course, we could chat about those too, figure out what are things you liked or disliked about those. A lot of people come from a background of maybe they've dabbled in Game Maker, they've dabbled in RPG Maker, or, you know, Dark Basic or something else at some point in the past. And it's to explore what they liked and didn't like about those projects, the affordances of the language, things they really feel like they got about it, disliked about it, and so on, can help us figure out what they want to work on that they couldn't have done in the past. I ask if someone's been a part of any other game development communities, which obviously Game Keto Club is an example of one of those communities these days. But in the past, it might also be internet forums that they've lurked, that they've been a part of, online sites like Gamma Sutra where they've read a lot of articles from. Helps me get a sense for what kind of attitude or work culture they're coming from in terms of where their headspace is at. I ask if people prefer solo-sized things. There's people who do solo stuff because they're building their way up towards teams and they want to gain that confidence that comes from feeling secure in their own understanding before they feel like others are counting on them. There's others who work on solo-sized stuff because that's their goal. Because they just want to make things alone, even if it takes them much longer, even if it, runs into more limitations of their current skill set. Some people just really thrive on and love the solo experience. And it's identifying, okay, are you doing solo as a means to the end of getting to a team? And maybe even leading a team? Or are you doing solo because that's the end game? And if it is, okay, well then we can approach things a little bit differently than if you're trying to really prepare yourself to be parts of teams in the future. I ask if someone's got a portfolio page or other web presence. This, of course, helps me catch up on things about their past work. If they've been doing any sort of audience or list building on social media, on YouTube, on a mailing list or otherwise, for their reach. And, of course, oftentimes early in people's progression, they're not doing it yet. One of the things about this, though, is it's often beneficial to start those things before you need them. To start building up that audience, start building up that reach, because by the time you need them, it's too late to start then. Ask about people's frequency and duration that they're able to work on something. And this one's really hard for someone new to it to be honest with themselves about. It's a bit like if someone's starting a workout routine and they haven't been exercising, and a personal trainer asks them, how many hours and how many days do you think you're going to work out? And as if some people said, okay, well, right now I'm between work or whatever, or I'm a college student, so I'm going to fit in 5 hours a day, 5 days a week. And it's like outside of classes or outside of whatever. And you just can't. You got to warm yourself up to this stuff. You got to kind of build up the habit. And so it's often helpful to try to first, even if you have available big blobs of time, starting out with a more modest goal, an evening or two a week, an hour or 3 or 5 once or twice a week, and going from there. If you can add more on top of that because you've got that space in your schedule, that can be great. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a marathon and not a sprint. It's not a game jam. It's not a one-time 3-day thing and you're done with game making for half a year. It's figuring out what you can sustain and what you can sustain happily without becoming rapidly burnt out on game development. So that's on top of everything else going on in your life. Day job, relationships, social life, school, other interests you have. It's figuring those out. Another way we often kind of divide those up, well, I'll share those strategies in another video because I've got all kinds of techniques for fixing that. And then lastly, and this sort of becomes sort of the first part of this pattern that for many people becomes when they're making their personal progress, figure out what's their goal they're trying to have for the next time we meet. So if you and I were going to meet again in a week from now, it'd be saying, what are you going to try to have done between now and next time? Is it something about clarifying your project you want to start working on? Is it something about, okay, well, there's this thing you've kind of been prototyping on, you want to pick back up and kind of get that back in shape? Whatever it might be, it's figuring out concretely what is your goal between now and next time. And this is really important because a lot of the real learning that happens either from running into those problems on your own time, and then the meetings with me become a chance to revisit where'd you get stuck, what questions came up. But that you've tried it on your own time can be a really valuable part of making sure it's really sinking in and that it's part of your learning and your growth. Occasionally wind up in these patterns, unfortunately, where someone only winds up working while they're on a call with me, and I can still kind of co-pilot and advise on that, and that can be part of the experience, and that's okay. But really, a lot of the learning happens best if you put in the time between them. It's a bit like if I was a piano teacher, to go back to our music examples. If someone only plays when their piano teacher's there, it's going to limit their growth and acceleration of that skill and their comfort and fluency in it. The more time they can put in practice between those sessions, the more it's going to pay off in the long run. So anyway, that's my series of introductory questions. Obviously, it didn't take as long today because I'm mostly talking over and explaining stuff rather than pausing and let you answer them. If you didn't really take the time to think about your answers to these, I do encourage, if you're just starting out in game development, maybe give it a try. Restart this video, pause after each question, give yourself a chance to think about what your answers are for it. Maybe it'll help you figure out and feel out which pathway you want to follow going forward for continuing to make games. Thanks so much for tuning in.